Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, your instructor for this course. And what we are going to do today is we are going to focus on Module 3. And as you have probably seen, the title of Module 3 is Groups, Classes, and Families. You might say, why would we cover a topic like that in a political science course? These are the topics that usually they focus either in anthropology class or sociology class. Well, the reason we focus on those topics within our course is because those factors, the groups, classes, and families, they have tremendous amount of impact on the political system of the region. All right. So as you have noticed, in addition to choosing reading number 3, which is basically one of the chapters of James Bill's book on the politics of the Middle East, it's a classic work. Okay, I have also chosen 4 classical articles because there's not much recent news about some of these things, even though one of the articles, the first one by Professor Jones on making the Middle Eastern working class, which talks about some new trend in terms of how the role of the labor has actually decreased. In other words, in 1960s, 70s, and even early 80s, we would see some impact of the role of labor as a unit in the politics of the area, but has really decreased because of the growth of political Islam. And then it didn't matter if they are in the Shia countries like Iran and Iraq, or if they are in the Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and others. The role of Islam and the Islamic, leaders and everything have tremendously increased, and then the masses actually are following a lot of those people more. Plus, then we have with the impact of the social communications and social media, we saw that for example, during the Arab Spring, social media was very, very useful for the masses to organize in different, squares and everything. So that has, in a way, brought some changes, and that's what the articles they try to communicate with you to bring the material to the center and update it for you. But the rest of it, these are facts about the Middle East that we all need to know. So in addition to Jones's article, which is the newest one of those, we have also the Bayat article, focusing on the Cairo's poor. Now, that's just one example. We are focusing on that one on Egypt, but that's just basically one example of how the poorer classes, they are functioning and what is going on with them within the Middle East politics. Then we have Joe Benini's, article about the working class and the peasantry. So when the first article focused on the working, classes, like basically labor and people who are working in manufacturing or something, this one focuses on peasantry, which is obviously one of the oldest, groups in the Middle East. And then, for example, Cockburn, article on Iraqi's resilient minority, it focuses on a particular ethnic group. In this case, in Iraq, it focused particularly during the Saddam Hussein period, but there are some essence of it that you might say, wait a minute, the article deals with Saddam Hussein, but it's just not dealing with only rule of Saddam Hussein. It's just about how that particular ethnic group was functioning within the system. Is that right? And the realities of that still exist, even though there is no more Saddam and the Iraqi system has changed significantly. So that's what I wanted to make sure that you realize. Now, in this particular module, I have actually put like 4 figures for you, which I like to start with that because as you can see right there, in our PowerPoint, the PowerPoint is very simple. Okay, it starts with an introduction in a way that I have been describing things for you. It's going to end up with the conclusion, and in between, we are going to focus on Roman numeral 2 groups structure and Roman numeral 3 class structure. Okay. But what I want to communicate with you first, to show some graphics in your posting. Obviously, you do not need to have, cite the figures or something. But in terms of understanding exactly how things are going on, the graphs help you a lot. Because I organize these graphs to fit all the reading material together plus the stuff that I wanted to communicate with you. I hope that helps you. Okay, so having said that one, let me see if I can go to the graphs. Okay, I'd like to start with the traditional graph, which is this. Okay, so it actually goes without saying that in many parts of the world, not just in the Middle East, we divide the society traditionally to like a pyramid, and in this pyramid we focus on political division as opposed to economic division. Okay. When you focus it on that regard, you know that economically, usually societies are divided into, in the modern period, into what? Three groups of upper class, middle class, and lower class. Now, notice that this particular, pyramid, it basically shows a little bit of our bias in the West. Why? It shows middle class as being very large. Is that right? This is what we like to see, because we like the middle class is like the backbone of the society. Okay? So, of course, there are going to be upper classes, but we want the middle class right there, pretty good size, is that right? It's the backbone of the society. And we want a much lower, numbers in terms of the low class, is that right? The lower division. Now, economically speaking. Politically speaking, it's very simple. The whole area is divided into two parts only. The upper classes in the economic one are also the political elite. And then the rest of them, which would be considered in economic terms middle class, and lower classes that would be part of the masses. So this should not surprise you, because in any society, we usually say that the power is divided between two classes. Who has power? Everybody has power. Elite has power, masses have power. Of course, the power of the elite is much more, extensive and much larger than those of the masses, especially in the countries that are authoritarian. Is that right? For lack of a better term. But please do not underestimate the power of the masses. The masses, they could, and that's what has happened, and that's what we're going to talk about. They can bring change in form of a revolution. Is that right? To their own country. Okay, having said that one, let me decrease this one and then take a look at this one again. Then, the other way we can look at the politics of the region is by focusing on what? You have these graphs, by the way. I'm hoping that as you're watching this video, you're also looking at your own figures. Okay, so as you can see right there, not only we have that what we call the horizontal, division, is that right? With upper and middle and lower. Actually, nowadays, even this horizontal division is much more sophisticated than ever before. What do I mean by that? It's more sophisticated because technically each one of those classes, three general classes, is that right? They are actually divided into more, smaller groups, but more meaningful one. Like, for example, what? Like the upper class is divided into upper, middle upper, lower upper. Middle class, upper middle, middle, lower middle. Lower class, upper, lower, middle, lower, lower. I think this type of subdivision, I hope it's not confusing you, okay? But this type of subdivision, I think actually is a much better and more accurate picture, you see? Because when you say, it's like, for example, dividing the grades between A, B, C, and D, is that right? And then say, no, this student got a B+. Well, there's a big difference between a B+ and a B-, is that right? So here, I would say from the perspective of a scientist, focusing on the region from a perspective of a scientist who's actually a political scientist. Remember, power is always going to be the concept that in the back of our mind we have when we look at the society. Those subdivisions make it actually to be a more accurate one. Now, beside the traditional horizontal, division, that some people, they call it class analysis, and the term class analysis is usually associated with, Professor Karl Marx, okay, and Marxist perspective. In the Middle East, I would say another division which is very, very important is these vertical divisions. You might say, what's a vertical division? It's a vertical division that starts from the top, comes down. You see what I mean? You see the lines right there? Now, what would be a good example of that? When we study, for example, Saudi Arabia, is that right? It's a tribal society. There are many tribal societies in the Middle East, okay? Tribal societies are not horizontal. They are vertical division. For example, here we go. Saudi Arabia, is that right? Named after Ibn Saud and his tribe, okay? So here we go. Not everybody in the tribe has what? The same level of power, but the tribe exists by supporting its members, all the way from top to the bottom, from upper all the way to lower, okay? So in that regard, we have that group leading, okay, But we realize that not all of them have the same amount of wealth and influence and everything else. So that's important, because how could we study a country like that? By not understanding the backbone of that society, which is a tribal structure. Okay? That one, I give you that one as one example, but very frankly, all of them, they have that type of structure. Is that right? Pretty much. All right. In addition to that, which is, status, group, tribal is a part of what we call informal group. They actually have also formal groups like association, institutions, groups. Like, for example, the group of, let's say, the Association of Writers. Now, their associations are not as influential as ours, the formal association, but they're still important. There are those writers and scholars which are much more well known, is that right? And there are those who are not as much, okay? It's important to know. However, remember one thing. In the Middle East, in general, up to now, with the exception of Israel, okay, which has a system which is closer to the European system than a typical Middle Eastern country, is that right? Informal group are much more important than formal group. In Western society, North American society, and in Israel, formal groups are usually much more important. We're not suggesting families are not important in Western Europe and North America. We were just saying families and groups and these type of things are much more important in that part of the world. Does this make any sense? Okay. Now, I'm going to decrease this one, and I'm going to show you a couple of other things that when I talk about it during the presentation, you already have some background in terms of what is it all about. One of the other things I would like to talk about is what we can look at the class structure in the Middle East in form of circles. Okay, so of course you can make a pyramid out of that one, but in reality we can say the upper classes, they were making like the bullseye of a target. Is that right? Right in the center. And then around them, there is the middle class. This is the traditional one. There's the middle class, and there is the lower classes. Now, so the upper classes were usually consist of the warriors, the top clergy, the top, business people, and the top political position. Is that right? That were all in one. And usually they were intermarry. Okay? Now, what about the middle class? The middle class has traditionally consisted of bureaucrats who were running the show based on the wishes of the upper class, bourgeoisie, which is basically the little capitalistic groups. These are the people who are usually have the control in the bazaars. Okay. And the last but not least, the clerics. Now, these clerics right here, the religious leaders, they don't have the same, influence of the top echelon, clergy in the upper division. Is that right? They're usually coming from the middle class background. They have an understanding and everything. And sometimes some of them are followers of the top. Some of them start questioning based on their own interpretation of their holy books, the upper crust. Okay. Then we have the lower classes. The traditional lower classes in the Middle East are, of course, peasants. Remember, Middle East is the cradle of the civilization. We have talked about Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, which nowadays we call Iraq, remember? And we have talked about, for example, the Nile River, another cradle of the civilization. So these areas, remember that the original civilization, they came out around the river areas. Why? Because the river was providing life. It was providing water for their drinking, water for their agriculture, also was a way for transportation. Is that right? Okay, so that's very important. Then we have the nomadic people. Nomadic people are the ones who were doing animal husbandry. Is that right? And in the Middle East, it's not like, for example, in the Old West, in our country, that they were moving cows. They weren't really moving cows. They were moving a lot smaller animals, like goats and sheep. Why? Because they're smaller. They don't eat as much as a cow, okay? But they still produce milk. And from that milk, you have what? Other dairy products. Milk, yogurt, cheese, this, that, butter, everything else. So you do have it, all right? Consistency is different, but you still have it. Plus, the animal doesn't completely destroy the land. Because remember, there is a relationship between the nature and what? Their business. If they completely destroy one area and the grass doesn't come back, becomes desert, what are you going to do next season? how are you going to feed your animals? Is that right? And these people were nomads because in the summertime, they would usually go closer to the mountain areas, and in the highlands, well, the weather is a little bit cooler, but still there is some grass on the ground and everything. And in wintertime, when the mountains and everything, they're very, very cold, maybe some, not very suitable, they would come all the way to the flats and lower areas, and over there they were what? Feeding their animals. So that's very important. And of course, then there are the workers. Now, these workers we're talking about in the traditional system, they're not the same as the modern workers. Modern workers, they work in factories. These people were not working in a factory. What were they doing? They were doing handcraft. Is that right? So they could make, for example, china dishes. They could make, for example, metal platters. They could make wheels. You see what I mean? Or plows for agricultural products. So these are those traditional, labor of the Middle East. They are very different from what we think about, labor, maybe there is an assembly line, and these Ford, or GM or Chrysler cars that come in, and these people with all those gears and all those new equipment. No, that's not it, okay? That's the modern version we're going to talk about now. All right, so let me minimize this one. Touch that one more time to show you the what's going on now. Okay, so we are going over all these graphs, so you have the nice background. So when I go over these things and talk about it, your mind is already well prepared. Notice. See, what's the difference between this one and the previous one? The upper classes are there, the middle class is there, and the lower class. Everything I said about that, graph in form of, circles and everything is true, except two things. In the modern period, the lower classes also have industrial workers, the one that you and me usually think about, people working in the factory, assembly line, blah, blah, blah. That's it. And then the middle class also has what? Professionals. Who are the professionals? University professors, lawyers, doctors, you name it. You see? So, the introduction of these two new classes within the old structure is changing the entire politics of the Middle East. Why? Because the professionals are highly educated. The guy, yes, maybe he was a son of a Bazari guy. Is that right? And you know Bazar, what I'm talking about. All right. In the Middle East are these, areas that, the merchants, they sell from spices all the way to carpets and this and that clothing and everything. All right. Maybe the guy comes from that family. But he went to Europe. He went to America. Is that right? That's what they call America. They didn't say United States. They said America. They went to America and they got great education. Oh, they're so proud of themselves. They got a PhD. They did this. They did that. They go back to their own country. Okay, they put them to work in a university. And then university is trying to treat, and the system is trying to treat these people just like traditional members of the society. They say, wait a minute. I can read your policies and I can see this part of it doesn't make sense. That part of it doesn't make sense. So what do? They start questioning. And that's how rebellion starts. That's exactly what happened in Western Europe. When people they started after economically getting stronger. Do you remember the Western development model? Okay. Then when they started doing that one, then they started questioning the authority. And that's why, when the authority would not let them to make any changes, the system would blow up, okay? Become a revolution, full-fledged revolution like the French Revolution of 1789. If the system was a little bit flexible and they said, okay, I'm going to work with you, but you need to slow down a little bit. And instead of they call it the British middle-class revolution, but in reality, it wasn't a revolution, it was an evolution. Because revolution is a lot of change in a short period of time. Evolution is small changes over time. And that's what happened in Great Britain. In both cases, the system is going to start changing. In the Middle East has been what? Combination of both of those things you can see. All right? But what I wanted to let you know is the role of that new class, professionals in the middle class. And guess what? The industrial workers are the same, They have more education than the traditional workers. They say, wait a minute, I have an AA degree in this and that, and I know how to fix this well. And what are you talking about? You see? So education has empowered these people to question authority. And that's something I want you to remember. Because that's changing the politics of the area. Now that we covered that one, we can go over this. All right? So we covered this one. Now here we go. introduction. What's the significance of that? As I mentioned, in a way, significance of it is basically that groups, classes, and families, they are a backbone of understanding the politics of the Middle East, particularly families, okay? What type of stratification? In a way, we talked about horizontal, stratification, what we call classes, vertical stratification, what we call groups, is that right? We talked about the definitions of these terms, like formal groups. Do you remember? We talked about associations, association groups, institutional groups, informal groups, like tribes, etc., etc. I'm bringing together, again, the material that Professor, James Bill is introduced in that module, 3's reading, plus some of the material from what? The articles I just mentioned. All right, here we go. Group structures, the vertical one. Here we go. Group patterns in the Middle East. What are the reasons for significance of informal group, politics of informal group, families, and power of women? Well, what can we say about the group patterns in the Middle East? Group patterns in the Middle East is very different from other parts of the world. Different regions of the world, different cultures, different things. This is very different. Reasons for the significance of informal group. Formal groups require a level of education, etc., and the necessary background in terms of institution and social contract and everything for those systems to work. Okay, that's why it works in Israel, because a lot of people who went to Israel, they were already educated people from Europe and North America. Okay, so they established a system in Israel which is closer to the European and North American system. Okay, and then the other, Jews that they moved to Israel, they came from other parts of the world. They said, okay, well, this is the rule of the game. If I want to do something, I better play with the rule of the game. You see? So the system was, the agenda was established by the, immigrants from Europe and North America, and then everybody else from Asia, Africa, etc., kind of accepted it. It's okay, we have to go with the flow. All right? But traditionally, that would have been the case in Israel either. So that, in that regard, is very different. But in the rest of the Middle East, is that right? Especially the ones that are under Islamic, culture and everything, informal group traditionally are much more important. All right. Politics of the informal group. Well, informal groups, they require things such as personal relationship. Is that right? They require things like, for example, personal cult. You are providing your support to particular individual because that individual is going to, support you. Is that right? It's not like that individual is running for an office and you're giving him a vote, etc., etc. No. It's a very different system in that regard. Families, as I mentioned, families are very important. Families, they play a lot of roles. Like what? In a society like that, for materialistic needs that you have, all the way from jobs, this, that, family is basically there. It's your parents and their connection that provide you with the opportunity so you can work here and there. You see, it's your cousin and your second cousin. Look, we Americans, we barely know our first cousins, okay? The Middle Easterners, they know the second, third, fourth. My goodness gracious. When I go to visit over there, because I have a Middle Eastern look, from my father's side, my mother's side, the Italian side, it doesn't show as much, all right? Then they are kind of wondering, you say, how come you don't know this and that? How come you don't know your whole family? I said, well, I just dealt with basically my first cousin like most other people, but not the other one. They knew everybody, and they were using that as a network, you see? So the family provides you with economic, benefits. The family, when you get old, there is not much of a social security system or something. Provides you with things that you can survive. The family provides you with the political support. You see? Family is very important. And then last but not least is the notion of what? Power of women. Traditionally, we have a tendency to think, women in the Middle East, they're all under the hijab and everything, they have no power. But we are going to talk about it, as you read in some of those articles and also in the main text. Don't underestimate the power of women. Okay? Here we go. Now, we're going into what? More detail. So, notice that I'm covering the same thing, but we keep going to more and more detail. So, group structure. Group pattern in the Middle East is formal versus informal group. Association versus institutional. I'm not going to go any further because I thought Bill's book in that regard is very good. So notice that my PowerPoints are basically our study guide. Is that right? Because I take those things from summarizing the main points of the readings and putting them all together. So I'm not going to add anything new for you. I want you to go and read it. I'm not going to repeat that same information. Next one, group structure. What are the reasons for the significance of informal groups? See, that could make a very nice short answer. I could ask you, guys, could we mention 3 out of the 5 reasons for significance of informal groups in an exam? In exam 1, for example. I can say that. Is that right? Actually, this has been a question. All right, so here we go. Absence of formal group conditions, Middle Eastern group size and trust is very important. Small group, attain goals much better than the bigger groups. Is that right? Because in a bigger group, you get lost. In small groups, individuals, they make a difference because leadership comes to play a very important role. And then notably, nobility of the manner and the small group, defends the public. So a small group, like a defender of the general public, okay? Here we go. So, group politics of the informal group, So, groups can be known as like cliques, as what we say, factions. So, what are some of the examples of it? I can ask you, give me some example. Again, I chose this one from all the readings that you have had, okay? It's not coming from nowhere, In Saudi Arabia, they call it bashka. In Kuwait, they call it Diwaniya. And in Iran, they call it Dore. Dore means a circle. That's all right? Diwaniya is basically a gathering of people together. And in a bashka, same thing, a gathering. So this is a clique. Important characteristic of this is the spirit of personalism. Okay? In other words, being a particular individual and your accomplishment and your position in the society matters. That's very important. All right. I remember when I was in Kuwait, Vasta, they call it Vasta. Is that right? Connection. All right. It was very important. I was trying to get my driver's license. Like everybody else, I was going to these lines. Very long lines, every day. One day you have to go to the long line of, pardon me expression, it was a medical checkup, to give a urine sample, blood sample, this and that. Another day you have to go and take the test. Another day you have to go and every line was different. Very long lines. So one night I was in one of the Diwaniyas in Kuwait, and they asked me, "Oh, Dr. Sadi, how do you like our country?" I said, "It's a very nice country. People are very hospitable and everything, but oh my God, it takes so long to get a driver's license." They said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, I told them about how long I've been waiting in each one of those lines, and sometimes it gets to the few people before me, and they close the line. Then what are you going to do? You have to go back the next day." He said, "You shouldn't be doing that. Tomorrow I send my driver, and then you just, he's going to take you to the right place." And then he picked up a piece of paper, and he wrote something on it that he didn't show me. Is that right? Folded up, put it in an envelope. He said, "Please carry this one, with you." I said, "Okay." So the next day the driver came, and then, he said, "Doctor, I'm going to go park the car. Please, because it's going to be far. You might want to, get out of the car right here to walk over there." I got out of the car. I went to the long line again. He said, "Why are you waiting in the long line?" I said, "I'm waiting my turn." He said, "Okay, don't worry about it." He went right inside the police department and everything. 2 minutes later, he came back with 2 police officers. I said, "Oh my God, am I going to get arrested? What did I do?" Is that right? They came over there and said, "Are you Dr. Sadi?" "Yes." "Do you have your, identification?" "Yes." "Here we go, identification." He said, "You shouldn't be standing right here." "Okay, what should I do?" "You follow us." I followed them all the way inside. They took me to an office. I'm sitting down over there. They took all my paperwork. They went over there, did something. I'm sitting in the office. I'm drinking tea. I'm eating cookies, I'm watching TV, and having conversation with a few other people, all right? And in a matter of like half an hour, everything finished. They gave it to me. I got my driver's license. I couldn't believe it, You see? So what came out handy? That Vasta, that connection person, all right? So I don't do these things because I go and isolate myself in a library and I keep reading about it. I'm an area study person. I actually travel there and I experience it. So that was a great experience. Here we go. Another thing, in terms of families, notice that again, I mentioned the term, but we're going more into detail. Significance of kinship. Kinship is hard to destroy. Even, for example, when we discovered that Osama bin Laden, is that right, is behind all these things. Bin Laden's family are one of the richest families in Saudi Arabia. Is that right? He was kids number 17 out of, I don't know, 40-something kids, of his dad. All right? Even though many of his brothers and sisters didn't agree with some of his stuff, but they were still protecting him and his wife and children and things like that. So even when you do stuff like that, they're still trying to protect you. All right? Then, nuclear family versus extended family. In the West, we have nuclear family. Dad, mom, brother, son, daughter, dog, cat, and we see grandma and grandpa, when they don't smell like Bengay, every once in a while, okay? Maybe a cousin here and there, or auntie or uncle. That's it. Is that right? Nothing more than that. Here, we're talking about extended family. Many times, the families, they live with their grandpa and grandma in the grandpa and grandma's home. How often do we do that? I know that the new generation, because sometimes it's very expensive, they come back to live with their parents. But that's usually temporary. They don't want to stay there. These people, they stay there. And then there is, so then in that type of environment, uncles and aunties from both sides, mother and father, become so important. Cousins, you get to know not just your first cousin, you get to know your second cousin, your third cousin, your fourth cousin once removed, your fifth cousin. I barely know just my first cousins. Is that right? Just like, most typical Americans. But these guys are believe in very extensive family. So families, they become what? Very, very important. There are families that their name is very important, like the Mori family in Egypt. It doesn't matter how many times Egypt has changed its system from imperial to kingdom, from kingdom to a republic. Mori's family have always been there, and they still have a lot of important points. One of the reasons that they say that Shah of Iran could not actually control Iran simply was because the Pahlavi, dynasty, they were small, I mean, you look at, for example, the Saudi family, there are like thousands of princes and princesses. In the, Pahlavi dynasty, they were like, I don't know, they were basically like 4 or 5 kids of, Reza Shah. Is that right? The Shah was one of them. Some of them, they got killed. Some of them, they got, helicopter accident or plane accident or whatever else. And each one of them, they had 1 or 2 kids. Goodness gracious, the Saudi family, 1 or 2 kids. Every one of those couples, they have like 6, 7, 8 kids. Is that right? So having a big family like that, you can control a country which is much smaller than Iran. Iran has like 80 million. Saudi Arabia has barely about 20 million. Is that right? So 1/4 of Iran, but much larger family. So that family is everywhere. Not just in the political arena, in economic arena, security arena, in the military, in this, in that. You see what I mean? Makes it a little bit easier to control. So one of the reasons that system has been more stable. 3 ways to magnify your kinship ties. One of them is by communicating with as many blood relatives. All right. I remember once I was in Afghanistan and I mentioned my name. They said, "Oh, wait a minute. Are you from the Sadris of blah 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 as opposed to Sadris of this and that?" I thought, I don't know. These guys, they knew. They said, "Oh, I'm so and so, and this and that is this, and this and this." And I did a little bit of a Google search about you, and I found out that your father's side of the family, who are the Sadris, are from the center of Iran, from the city of Isfahan, and my cousin from this one, dad was from this. And I thought, I was baffled by it, honest to God, okay? So he found out that he's my, 5th cousin twice removed. I didn't say anything. I said, "Wow, I'm glad that we are relatives." He said, "Since you're my relative, I'm going to help you." I was just happy with, since I'm your relative, he's going to help me. Okay, that was the part. Because when you're in the field, we're really at the mercy of people over there. All right. Next one. Using a very broad definition of kinship. That who is family, who is not family, again, by knowing who is your, first of all, blood family, and then, blood relatives, better to say. And then, okay, they said, yeah, this is my blood relatives, is that right? But this blood relatives married so-and-so from that family, so now that family is also our family, informally. I thought, oh, okay, very good, fine. I was just, fascinated by how they explain those things. I'm not questioning it, and I'm not, making a comedy or joke out of it. I'm just baffled by that, by somebody who looked like them from their perspective, but obviously did not understand the sophistication of the family structure there. Expanding ties via marriage. That's another one. Okay? So you want to extend your family? Okay, so your cousin marries so-and-so from that. Now you better get to know those people because now they're part of our structure too. So very, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay? Then we can talk about the power of women. And here, of course, the stereotypes that I told you about. Is that right? But the actual history, for example, Prophet Muhammad, he treated his wife beautifully. Is that right? When he was with Khadija, who was, when he was 20, he married Khadija, who was 40 years old. Is that right? So they had 20 years age difference. Okay? But, and then his kids basically are pretty much, they came from her, her. All right? And then when Khadija died, then he married Aisha, who was technically his cousin. That's one of the traditional things in the Middle East. At that time, particularly, they were marrying their cousins. Okay, I noticed that in my trips to the Middle East, in the Arab societies, not so much right now Persians or Kurds or whatever. That's also a tradition. That many times they marry their cousins. Sometimes their first cousin. Which from my family perspective, first cousin is like brother and sister because we grew up together. It's kind of different. All right. Then Fatima, his daughter. So all these things that they say about, oh wow, they look down at women, they do this, they do that. Not necessarily true. Is that right? Prophet Muhammad, if they really truly follow the path of Prophet Muhammad, he really valued women. So, in fact, that was one of the things that got me into trouble in Saudi Arabia. One time I was over there and I was just trying to discover a little bit more about the whole notion of women are not supposed to drive. Why women are not supposed to drive? Khadija used to ride it, camel and horse. And then Aisha, who was younger, when Khadija died, he married Aisha. And when Khadija was older, Aisha was younger. Is that right? The younger wife. So she would jump on the, camel and horses and go. And then sometimes by that time, Muhammad was a little bit older. See, and that time, remember, 40 years old was considered old. Nowadays, people, they say, oh, I'm in my 40s, whatever else. And they consider middle age like 50s and 60s. If you say 50s and 60s is middle age, which means, is this guy supposed to last to 120? But that's what the notion is. Is that right? So she would get on that, and he would never say, oh yeah, no, you cannot do that. You're a woman, you cannot do that. Or for example, to his daughters, like, Fatima and the other one, Kulsum, or the other one. He never said stuff like that. So I was wondering what is happening. So I told them, they invited me to a bashka, they fed me and this and that. Oh, American professor, Muslim, blah, blah, blah. I didn't say anything, is that right? So whatever. So I went over there and I said, well, I teach courses about Middle East. Could you please tell me that why in Saudi Arabia women are not allowed to drive and everything? He said, oh, professor, it's because, in Quran says that. And, I was being polite about it, but I said, really? Could you please show me which, chapters and, lines and everything? And they said, oh, yeah, we're bringing it. They brought stuff. And I've read the Quran in Arabic, in English, in Persian. You see what I mean? And I knew there's not such a thing. But, you need to act stupid and then find out, what's going on in their mind. So then they couldn't find it. They said, well, actually, it's our interpretation of this and that. I said, well, our interpretation. But isn't it true that in Islam, we follow the tradition of the Prophet? They said, of course we do. I said, would you please correct me? I think I remember that Prophet never stopped, his first wife, and when she died, the second one or anybody else, from riding a camel or horse, which at that time would be equal to driving a car. Is that right? They said, yeah. And I said, also his daughter. He never prevented his daughter. They said, yes. I said, I'm getting confused. So how does that one work with this if you're following the tradition of the Prophet? I noticed the guy, as soon as I said that, he started getting really red. Okay? I thought, oh, geez. All right, well, what's going on? He said, well, he didn't have really anything to say. And then he told me, well, Professor, are you making, comparison between the family of the Prophet and ordinary people? I said, but Prophet Muhammad, he was very down-to-earth person. He told everybody, I cannot read and write. He didn't write Quran. It would come to him, and then there were people sitting down and they were writing this stuff. They said, that's true. I said, yeah. He also said, he never said like Jesus that, oh, I'm a son of God or I'm this. He said, I'm an ordinary person who cannot read and write. I used to be a businessman. Then, Angel Gabriel came on me and they told me that, hey, you have a mission, and he followed it. You see what I mean? He didn't even know those stuff. Khadija told him that, oh, this experience is Gabriel, because Khadija used to read Old Bible, Old Testament of the Jews, because there were a lot of Jewish tribes and, thing. And she was educated woman, all right? So anyway, to make the long story short, I have to tell you that certain people, not everybody, they didn't like what I said. But interesting enough, the group started getting divided as, oh my gosh, this professor is saying something very interesting. Is that right? And they started, so the group was getting divided. Not fighting though, don't worry, I didn't cause any kind of fight. But I think I made certain people really upset with me. So on my cell phone, suddenly I got a call from the embassy because, I was a guest and, embassy was hosting me and everything. They said, Dr. Sadi, we don't want you to go to your car. We're going to send a car. They sent a car, bulletproof, for God's sake. I said, why are you doing stuff like that? It's going to get worse, But they sent a bulletproof car. They picked me up. They left the car over there. The next day, they sent a flatbed. We were checking underneath of it, etc., etc. After that incident, I couldn't go to Saudi Arabia. They wouldn't give me visa for 3 years, okay? So obviously, it didn't hit some people in the right way, And this was, of course, years before the new, Crown Prince takes charge. Now, getting back to the rest of the story, see, during the Abbasid period, for example, there were people like Zubaydah became very, very important women. She didn't like, for example, other ethnic groups. She wanted to Arabize the entire Islamic world, okay? So Barmakids, which were Persian, family, they were running the, court because Arabs, they didn't have any experience in running an empire, is that right? But the Persians and others, they were. So she got rid of them. Is that right? In Ottoman period and in the Persian Empire, also you see the role of the women to be so important. All right? So, and of course, in the contemporary period, there are a lot of very fine, women leaders. Is that right? Some of them, like some of the Iranian leaders, some of the other ones who are actually working for human rights and this and that and rights of the women, they've got Nobel Prizes and a lot of other prizes here and there. So do not underestimate their power, okay? In fact, one of the things I learned when I was in the Middle East was, I said, you know what? People around the world, they do not see very seriously, they don't take women seriously. They said, well, that's their mistake, because we consider ourselves as if the men are the head, we are the neck. And it's the neck that moves the head. I thought, wow, that's interesting. Because the more I studied, for example, about the previous leaders, even the most dictatorial people, like Saddam Hussein, is that right? Who killed his own son-in-laws. He would listen to his mom. Saddam Hussein, So I just couldn't believe it. How much power the mothers and women had in him. So it was very, very interesting. All right. Then there is no legal, of course, equality, but there is tremendous amount of economic, equality and power and political power of women. Depends on what the woman is coming from. Women from, upper, classes or something, they have a lot of political influence. Is that right? And all these things that you hear, stereotypes, oh, they beat up their wife, they beat up this. I'm not suggesting this is an acceptable behavior, but most likely the people that got beaten up is because they were from lower classes, but that happens even to the servants. Is that right? But in the Middle East, you marry somebody, you beat up your wife, the brothers are going to come beat you up. You see what I mean? There is just no if, but, maybe about it. It's not acceptable, because your wife is somebody else's sister or somebody else's, daughter. All right. General observation. So having more power, women have more power than is known. That's one. Power, many times the power is through men. They don't go over there to do something. They influence the men, and then the men follow the advice of their mothers or wife or sisters or somebody else. And then the movement toward what? Of course, equality in the Middle East. All right. What is the last thing that we want to talk about? The class, basically structure, which I already mentioned to you. Actually, I covered this one, as you notice, in the beginning, because I wanted you to have a good understanding of this in form of a figure, because when you do it in terms of a figure, then you do not forget it. Is that right? The very last slide is basically talking about class structure. Is that right? Horizontal one, which we talked about. Class and power. But the topic of class and power is not a new topic in political science. As you know, it goes back all the way to Professor Karl Marx, whose whole research is about a notion that later on became known as class analysis. Is that right? That he saw from his period of time that the two classes of rich and poor are throughout the history, they have been always in competition and conflict with one another. Okay, so that applies to the Middle East as well. Then we have the Western as opposed to Eastern model. Notice that in a good part of my lecture, I was trying to show you the comparison between the Western model and the Eastern model. Is that right? Western model family structure is very nuclear. Is that right? A very small unit: dad, mom, son, daughter, cat, dog, grandma, grandpa. Maybe when they will go to visit. But in the Eastern model, in the Middle Eastern model, what we have is we have extended family. Is that right? That these people, the children, they go and marry, and many times they bring their wife or husbands back to the same home, and then inside that home they have children. So the children kind of grow up constantly with both grandpa, grandma, and aunties and uncles, and they become playmates of their cousins or something. So they know each other very well. That's why the family structure is so strong there. Okay. And then, of course, we have the political and economic classes that we talked about. You remember I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, I showed you those pyramids, trying to show you this is the political one, this is the economic one. The economic one is divided into three parts, classes, and the political one, two classes of elite and masses. And then I showed you how sophisticated it could be by subdividing each one of those classes into smaller groups. Then we also, if you remember, we talked about we talked about the graph that was in form of circular shapes. Is that right? The old system, but as opposed to the new system, and the new system had two new classes: the professional and what industrial workers. So we talked about all of these things. I shared that with you right at the beginning because I wanted you to be able to digest the material, not just memorize, okay? Understand why things happen. And this has been a very nice blend of bringing all those materials together with the materials that I covered right at the beginning. How we conclude? If you want to really have a better understanding of the Middle East politics, you really need to understand the important role of family, which also leads into groups, and last but certainly not least, what? Classes. But the family and groups, they play a very significant role in terms of the impact of the informal groups in the politics of the Middle East. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, which I actually added some of the example from my own travels to the area and everything. And if you have any question, as always, please ask me, send me a message. Okay, thank you very much.